Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a topic today that I find super fascinating, and I bet you do too.
Uh-huh.
It's all about first impressions.
Oh, yeah.
But specifically, those first impressions that we form just from looking at someone's face.
Right, right.
We'll be digging into Alexander Todorov's book, Face Value.
Oh, interesting.
It's a total gold mine of research and insights on this.
Okay, yeah, I know that one.
Get ready for a cool mix of history, psychology, maybe even a little art appreciation thrown in.
Sounds good. I'm into that.
And to help us navigate this whole thing, I've got an expert with me who's amazing at making connections and finding those aha moments.
I'll try my best.
So are you ready to explore why we're so quick to judge a face and just how accurate those snap judgments actually are?
I am. It's something that I think really gets to all of us, right? We all kind of sense that faces matter.
Yeah, it's almost instinctive.
Yeah.
But before we jump into the modern science of it all,
Okay.
let's take a little trip back in time.
Oh, cool.
The idea that you can read someone's personality just from their face has been around for centuries. It's called physiognomy.
Right.
And it's kind of fascinating how these early attempts, even though they were often flawed,
Yeah.
well, they reveal something about how much we want to understand people. Like, it's a basic human drive,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, for sure.
For example, think about Giovanni Battista della Porta back in the 16th century.
Okay.
He wrote this book linking facial features to animal resemblances.
Oh, wow.
Like, if you had a forehead like a cow, you were considered stupid.
Oh, wow. So it's like those personality quizzes that tell you what animal you are.
Kind of. Or there's Lavater in the 18th century. His books were super elaborate.
Okay.
He'd analyze someone like Julius Caesar's face and be like, see, his nose proves he's a leader.
Oh, wow. So he kind of already had the answer in mind, and then he tried to fit the face to that?
It's a classic case of confirmation bias.
Yeah, exactly.
It's almost funny to look back on it now, but it shows how powerful that belief was.
Right.
That urge to find meaning in faces.
Totally.
But then things get really interesting in the early 20th century when psychologists started to get involved.
Okay.
They brought a more scientific way of looking at faces.
Makes sense.
At first, people were skeptical.
A bit.
Researchers like Secord were trying to find specific features, like a certain type of chin or eyebrow that would predict personality.
Okay.
But they didn't find much to support that idea.
Oh, interesting.
So no criminal brow or trustworthy chin after all.
Uh-huh.
But what they did find was still pretty fascinating.
What was that?
Even if individual features weren't reliable predictors,
Okay.
people were surprisingly consistent when it came to their overall first impressions of certain traits, like trustworthiness or dominance.
Oh, that's interesting. So, like, we were picking up on something, but it wasn't just one single feature that was giving it away.
Exactly. It was more about the whole picture, the overall impression.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where Leslie Zebrowitz comes in with her theory of overgeneralization.
Okay.
It's kind of like saying, we know babies have certain features, right?
Mhm.
Big eyes, round face, and we associate those with certain traits like being innocent or helpless.
Yeah.
But then we kind of extend those associations to adults, even if they don't really fit.
That makes sense.
So we might see someone with a baby face, you know, those rounded features, and unconsciously think they're naive or submissive,
Interesting.
even if they're a super successful CEO or something.
Yeah, right.
So even though we've moved past those old physiognomy ideas, we're still making these snap judgments based on faces.
Yeah. Sure.
And the crazy thing is, those judgments have real-world consequences.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Todorov's book is full of examples that make you go, whoa, I hadn't thought of that.
I bet. Can you give us an example?
Absolutely. One that really stood out is the impact of competent-looking faces in politics.
Yep.
Studies have shown that those candidates can have a real advantage in elections,
Oh, wow.
especially among voters who aren't as informed about the issues.
That makes sense.
It's not the only factor, of course, but it can make a difference.
Yeah, it's like those first impressions really stick with people.
And it's not just politics.
Oh.
Research suggests that CEOs who are perceived as competent tend to get higher salary offers,
Really?
even if that doesn't actually mean they'll do a better job running the company.
Mm.
And even in the legal system, there's evidence that those impressions of trustworthiness from faces
Right.
can actually influence criminal sentencing.
Wow, That's pretty powerful stuff.
It really makes you think,
It
right?
does.
It's not about saying that looks are everything, but it does make you question how much those unconscious biases are at play,
Yeah,
especially when it comes to important decisions.
absolutely.
So we've seen how powerful these first impressions can be and how they can have real-world effects. But what is it about a face that makes us see someone as trustworthy or dominant?
Right. What are we actually picking up on?
That's where the research takes some really fascinating turns.
Ooh, I'm intrigued.
We've moved beyond just manipulating single features and now use data-driven methods like, get this, reverse correlation.
Reverse correlation. Okay, that sounds kind of complicated.
I know, right? It took me a while to wrap my head around it, too. Basically, it's like this. Imagine you show people a bunch of faces,
Okay.
but each face has these subtle, randomized noise patterns overlaid on it.
Mm-hmm.
And you ask people to rate each face on a specific trait, like trustworthiness.
Gotcha.
Then you use some fancy algorithms to see which noise patterns were consistently associated with higher ratings.
Wow. Okay.
So it's like using a bunch of random visual noise to figure out the actual features that are driving those impressions.
You kind of trick the brain into revealing what it's actually looking for.
Exactly. And the really cool thing is, it's not just about isolated features.
Yeah.
It's about the whole configuration of features and how they work together to create that specific impression.
Oh, interesting. So it's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
You got it. And the book has these incredible visuals that really bring this to life. They show these morphing continuas where a face gradually shifts from looking untrustworthy to trustworthy, and you can actually see how subtle changes in shape and skin tone contribute to the overall impression.
Oh, wow. I'd love to see those.
They're pretty amazing. And here's the cool part. These configurations often map onto things we already understand, like emotional expressions
Okay.
or cues about masculinity and femininity,
Right.
and even age. So even though we're not consciously thinking about it, our brains are picking up on all these subtle cues and weaving them together to form a judgment.
It's wild, isn't it?
It really is. It's like our brains are these incredibly sophisticated pattern detectors, constantly searching for meaning in the visual world.
For sure.
But if our brains are so good at making these judgments, does that mean we're actually good at reading faces? Can we really tell if someone's trustworthy or dominant just by looking at them?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Right.
Like, do we have some kind of sixth sense for faces?
Exactly. And you know what? Todorov is pretty skeptical about that whole idea.
Oh, really?
He points out that a lot of those studies claiming to predict things like sexual orientation or criminal tendencies from faces,
Right.
well, they often have some flaws in how they were designed.
Okay.
For example, he talks about those studies on guessing sexual orientation from photos,
Yeah.
even in really controlled settings.
Mm-hmm.
The accuracy is barely above chance.
So not exactly a reliable superpower.
Right. It's a good reminder that we need to think statistically.
Okay.
We tend to overestimate how much information we can get from just one snapshot, a face, a photo, and we underestimate the role of chance and context.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like we see a face and we think we know everything about that person.
Right. And this is where the concept of base rates comes in.
Okay, what are those?
Let's say we know that a certain percentage of the population is trustworthy, right?
Okay.
Well, that's actually a more reliable starting point than trying to read it from someone's face.
Oh, interesting. So our gut feeling from a face might not be as accurate as just knowing the general odds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder to temper our intuition with a bit of logic.
I like that.
So, I think we've laid some good groundwork here.
Yeah.
We've looked at the history of trying to read faces, dived into some of the modern science behind first impressions, and even talked about the limits of those judgments.
Right. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But you know what? I have a feeling we've only scratched the surface.
You think so?
Oh, yeah. There's so much more to uncover.
Well, I'm ready for it.
Great. Because next, we're going to explore the power of context and how it can totally change our perceptions of a face.
I'm all ears.
Perfect. Stay tuned.
You know, one of the most important things to remember when we talk about first impressions is context.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Our emotions at that moment, the lighting, even just tilting your head a bit, it can totally change how we see a face.
It's like, yeah, a photo can be worth 1,000 words, but
Right.
those words can change depending on how you frame the photo.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Todorov, he gives this really interesting example
Okay.
about Jared Loughner,
Oh, right.
the guy who did the Tucson shooting back in 2011.
Yeah.
They showed students a photo of Loughner and asked for their impressions.
Okay, so I'm guessing
Yeah.
Those who knew about the shooting probably saw him as untrustworthy
Yeah.
and dangerous.
Yeah, you got it. But here's the interesting thing.
Okay.
The students who didn't know who he was,
Yeah.
they just thought he looked pretty average. Maybe a little untrustworthy, but nothing extreme.
Wow. So it really shows how what we already know can color our perceptions.
It's like our brains are trying to fit the face into the story we already have in our heads.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, but if context is so important,
Yeah.
why do we still hold on to those snap judgments about faces?
That's a good question.
Why don't we constantly update our impressions as we get to know someone better?
Well, I guess part of it is that we don't always get clear feedback on if our first impression was right or wrong.
It's true. You might meet someone briefly, form an opinion, but then you never really get to know them well enough to see if you were right.
Right, exactly. And even if we do get more information,
Yeah.
our brains, they're pretty good at ignoring anything that goes against our initial belief.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's way easier to just stick with that first impression than to constantly question it.
Like, it's almost like our brains are lazy, right?
Yeah.
They just want to put people in a category and be done with it.
It's like our brains are saying, okay, I've already filed this person under untrustworthy. I don't have time for a recategorization.
Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly.
You know, you mentioned earlier how our brains are wired to see patterns in faces.
Mm-hmm.
And that made me think about the whole evolutionary side of things.
Okay.
I used to believe that certain features,
Yeah.
like a strong jawline in men,
Right.
were universally attractive because they signaled good genes or something.
Yeah, that's a common idea.
But Todorov seems to be saying that's not necessarily true, right?
Yeah, he challenges that idea a bit. He says, while some of those evolutionary arguments about attractiveness do hold up,
Okay.
there's a lot more going on, too.
No.
For example, they've done studies on facial masculinity.
Oh, right.
And what they found is that women's preferences for that actually change depending on the culture.
Really?
And they don't always line up with those evolutionary explanations.
Wow. So those universal beauty standards might not be so universal after all.
Right, exactly.
It kind of reminds me of the whole nature versus nurture debate. Maybe it's a bit of both when it comes to what we find attractive in a face.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And speaking of specific features,
Okay.
Todorov also talks about this thing called the width-to-height ratio of the face, or FWHR for short.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. Isn't that the idea that a wider face means more aggression?
Yeah, that's the basic idea. Some researchers have suggested that, especially in men, a higher FWHR,
Okay.
meaning a wider face compared to its height, is linked to aggression.
I always wondered how reliable that research really is. Can we really predict someone's behavior just from measuring their face?
Right. It does seem kind of simplistic. And actually, Todorov agrees with that skepticism.
He does.
Yeah, he points out that the evidence connecting FWHR to actual aggression is pretty weak.
Hmm.
And even in the studies that do find a link,
Yeah.
the effect is often small and easily influenced by other things.
So there might be a subtle connection, but it's definitely not a foolproof way to tell if someone's going to start a fight.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Todorov even suggests that maybe our perception of a wider face as more aggressive
Yeah.
is because we have stereotypes about body size.
Oh, interesting.
Like, we see a wider face and unconsciously think of a larger body and then jump to conclusions about aggression.
It's another example of how our brains take these mental shortcuts, right?
Right, exactly.
Like we're always looking for patterns, even if they're not really there.
Yeah. And it's a good reminder that, well, faces can give us some clues.
Yeah.
We shouldn't overestimate how much we can actually read from them.
It's like we said before, it's not a crystal ball.
Exactly. But speaking of how our brains interpret faces,
Okay.
remember those data-driven methods we talked about earlier?
Yeah, like the reverse correlation stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, researchers have used those techniques to visualize how faces change
Okay.
when we manipulate those core impressions of trustworthiness and dominance.
Oh, right. I remember seeing those visuals in the book.
Yeah, it was really cool.
It was like watching those unconscious biases come to life.
Yeah. So when they make a face look more trustworthy digitally, the eyebrows kind of soften, the corners of the mouth turn up a little bit, it creates this subtle, happy expression.
It's like our brains are saying, trustworthy people are happy people. Interesting. What about for dominance? Does it go the opposite way?
Yeah, it's totally different. When they make a face look more dominant,
Yeah.
you start to see features associated with masculinity.
Oh, okay.
A stronger jawline, heavier brow ridge. They even change the skin texture to make it look rougher.
So it's not just about individual features then, but how they relate to these broader social categories and stereotypes we have.
Exactly. And it just shows how complex our facial perception really is.
Yeah.
Our brains are taking in all this information about shape, color, texture, expression,
Right.
and mixing it with all our previous knowledge and biases.
Wow, it's like trying to solve a giant puzzle.
Right.
But even though our brains are wired to make these judgments, it doesn't mean we have to just accept them blindly, right?
Definitely not. Awareness is key here. If we understand how these biases work, it can help us be more critical of our first impressions.
It's about remembering that our perceptions are just that, perceptions. They're influenced by a whole bunch of factors.
Exactly.
And they don't always reflect reality accurately.
That's a really important point.
One thing that really stuck with me from the book was how Todorov emphasized that our faces are dynamic.
Oh, right.
They're not static. They change all the time.
Yeah, they reflect our lives, don't they?
Exactly. It made me think about all those studies showing how not getting enough sleep can make you look less attractive, less healthy, even less intelligent.
It's crazy how much our lifestyle choices can affect how we look.
Yeah, and it's not just sleep. Our diet, stress levels, even smiling more.
Right.
It can all leave a mark on our faces over time.
It's like our faces are these living canvases telling the story of our lives.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about trying to read faces, the limits of those snap judgments, the power of context, and how dynamic our appearances are.
It's been a really interesting discussion.
It has. But you know what? I think there's still more to explore.
There is.
Oh yeah, we've only just scratched the surface.
Wow. Okay. I'm ready for more.
Great, because next we're going to dive in to the brain itself.
Oh, wow. Cool.
We'll explore how this incredible organ takes all those facial signals and turns them into those snapped judgments we've been talking about.
I can't wait.
Awesome. Stay tuned. We've talked about all these fascinating aspects of how we see faces, but there's one big piece missing.
And that?
The brain. How does this incredible organ actually make sense of all those facial signals and create those snap judgments?
Yeah, that's a whole other level, isn't it?
It is. And you know what?
Right.
Our fascination with faces starts super early. Like, even newborns with their blurry vision, they already prefer looking at face-like patterns.
Really, even that young?
It's like there's something about that basic arrangement of eyes, nose, mouth that just grabs our attention from the get-go.
We're just drawn to faces.
Researchers use these really clever techniques to study this.
Oh, like what?
They'll track where babies look the longest when they're shown different patterns.
Okay.
And guess what wins every time?
Faces.
Those simple, schematic, face-like images. It's not just any old pattern, though.
Yeah.
They've found that newborns prefer faces that are right side up A and D lit from above.
Huh.
Just like they would be in natural lighting. It's like we're programmed from birth to see faces as they appear in the real world.
That's pretty amazing.
It is. So we're born with this bias towards faces.
Yeah.
But what happens as we grow up?
Well, those abilities get even more refined, don't they?
They do. By 6 months old, babies are really drawn to moving faces.
Okay.
And by 7 months, they can actually tell the difference between different emotional expressions.
Wow. So they're starting to understand the feelings behind the face.
Exactly. And that ability just keeps developing through childhood and adolescence. We get better and better at recognizing individual faces, even as those faces change with age, hairstyle, expression, all that.
Right.
It really shows how adaptable the brain is.
Yeah.
How it can learn and change based on our experiences.
And as we see faces from different racial and ethnic groups,
Yeah.
our brains get better at telling them apart. It's a constant process of fine-tuning.
It's pretty incredible. So we've got these innate biases, a brain that's always learning, and this incredible ability to recognize and understand faces. But what's going on at the neural level? What's happening in the brain itself?
Well, there's these things called face selective neurons. Ever heard of those?
Oh, yeah. Those are the neurons that respond specifically to faces, right?
Yeah. They're like the face experts of the brain.
So it's not that they only fire when they see a face, but
Right.
their response is way stronger to faces than to other objects.
Exactly. Researchers have done these amazing studies with monkeys where they show that certain neurons will respond more to monkey faces than to human faces, or the other way around, depending on what the monkey's been exposed to in its life.
So it's both nature and nurture shaping those neural responses.
It's a perfect example of how our biology and experiences work together.
I love that. But these face-selective neurons, are just one part of the story, right?
Right.
There are whole networks in the brain that work together to make sense of faces.
Yeah, these networks are always taking in information
Yeah.
from different parts of the brain
Okay.
to help us not only recognize faces, but also understand expressions,
Yeah.
figure out people's intentions, and make those snap judgments we talked about.
Wow, it's like a complex orchestra with different sections all playing their part.
Yeah, great analogy.
Yeah.
Except in this case, the music can sometimes be a little off.
Right, because all those biases and illusions we talked about,
Right.
they come from how those brain networks are wired, don't they?
Exactly.
It's not that our brains are making mistakes. No.
They're doing what they've evolved to do.
Right.
Make sense of the world quickly and efficiently.
It's all about survival, right? Making those split-second decisions that could be the difference between life or death.
But sometimes those shortcuts lead to misinterpretations
Yeah.
and those stubborn snap judgments.
It's like our brains are saying, look, I got to make a quick call here. I'm
Yeah.
going to use these patterns I've learned, even if they're not always perfect.
So it's trade-off, right?
Yeah,
Speed and efficiency for potential biases.
exactly. And one last important thing to remember is
Yeah.
these brain networks, they're not fixed. They can change throughout our lives
Oh, interesting.
based on what we experience, who we interact with.
That's hopeful. So what does this all mean for us?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is
Yeah.
our perceptions of faces, they're incredibly complex. They're
right.
shaped by our biology, our experiences, and even our culture.
It's this fascinating mix of nature and nurture, isn't it? It really is. We're wired to pay attention to faces, to judge people based on how they look.
Right.
As part of being human, it helps us navigate the social world.
But it's so important to be aware of the limits of those judgments,
Absolutely.
to recognize those biases that can creep in
Yeah.
and distort how we see people.
If we understand the science behind first impressions, we can be more mindful of how we judge others.
And hopefully make fairer, more informed decisions. It's about appreciating the power of faces
Right.
without letting them control us.
Well said.
And with that, dear listeners, we've come to the end of our deep dive into the fascinating world of first impressions.
It's been a pleasure exploring all this with you. I hope you've learned something new about faces and how our brains work.
I know I have. And remember, there's always more to a face than meets the eye. Until next time, keep those faces fascinating and keep diving deep.